you and thank you for joining us for our community conversation and what proves to be a very informative hour of information. If you're like me, before seeing the video that Alexa was playing for us, you might have inadvertently, in a show of care, used the wrong terms and said things that were inaccurate. I am so grateful that Dr. Ladorhian corrected me when I sent out a message telling me that I was using the wrong verbiage. And I then knew that I needed to get educated. And I thought I probably wasn't the only one who needed more information about the war on Ukraine. And so we're very grateful that Dr. Ladorhian is here today. And I'd like to introduce you to him now at this point. Many of you may know him. He is a professor of biochemistry and molecular biology here at KUMC. He's a friend to many. He began his professional background in education in Ukraine, earning a Bachelor of Science in Physics and a PhD in biophysics before joining the University of Virginia and then Johns Hopkins for a postdoctoral fellowship. And now he is at KUMC. He had a stint with KUMC, I think from 2014 to 2018, and then he came back to KUMC in 2018. So again, I'm sure many of you know him and are friends. I'd like to turn the mic over to you now, Dr. Alexei Ladorhian.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm really honored to have this opportunity to present something about the war that was going on for quite some time. You may or may not realize, but the video you just saw was a week before recent hostilities started. In the West, people have been ignoring this war that was going for 8 years. Now they are finally paying attention. And here with my colleague and expert from KU will present some background. But before we do that, just to set up, I would like to show you a very brief fragment from a video from a Yale professor, Timothy Snyder. I think it has rather important introductory remarks. I hope you can see. Can you see the video? It will be played now.
Timothy Snyder into the conversation, Yale historian, author of many books, including The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America, and On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Your response to the latest developments right now?
Well, so we know what Russia's initial war plan was. It was premised on Mr. Putin's assumption that Ukrainians and Russians are really one people. So if he can simply send in a strike force to surround the Ukrainian capital and physically eliminate the Ukrainian government, then everyone will go over to the Russian side. We know that because it's consistent with the initial attack plan. We also know it because they accidentally published these documents a couple of days ago. So when we want to look at what's happening, I think we have to distinguish stage one, which was a failure, thanks to unexpectedly strong and intelligent Ukrainian resistance on the part of people who are essentially defending their homes, by the way, also from attacks on water supply, energy supply, apartment buildings, and everything which was listed already. All of those things have already been attacked, including cities. But so in stage one, the Russian plan fails because of Ukrainian resistance, but also because of its nature. Now we're moving to stage two, which will include precisely the things which were described before. We're moving towards more like a Grozny scenario or a Syria scenario, where the Russians will do what the Russians do in their doctrine. They besiege cities and then they pound them from the outside and with air power until the civilians force the leadership to capitulate. So unless these columns can be somehow stopped, or we can get to some kind of negotiated solution by way of pressure on Russia, we're going to see a much more horrifying stage of this war follow.
And Professor Snyder, can you talk about the you've mentioned Putin's belief that Ukraine and Russia are part of one nation. Can you describe your view of the historical truth here?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say even if Mr. Putin were a historian, it's not the job of a historian to say who belongs to what nation. You know, it's not my job to tell people, you know, in Africa what nations they belong to, or Canadians whether they belong to a nation or not. A nation is a group of people with a common sense about what the future holds and what they should be doing. And in that sense, Ukrainians are indisputably a nation. The history, I mean, since you ask, is just unbelievably wrong and abusive. The idea that because a Viking baptized himself 1,000 years ago, maybe, therefore Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia are one nation is palpably absurd. The idea that the Bolsheviks created Ukraine, as Mr. Putin claims, is also ridiculous. It's the other way around. The Soviet Union was created as a union, as a federation with national names, precisely because 100 years ago, even the far left in Russia was perfectly aware that Ukraine was a nation and had to be accommodated in some way. And this language, by the way, this language that other people are not states, that other people are not nations, that is the language of destroying the state and of destroying the nation. That's the logic that follows. And since we're on the topic, another of Mr. Putin's historical claims or abuses of historical language is the idea that he's carrying out a denazification campaign, when in fact what his army is doing, is set up to do, is to destroy a government which is led by a democratically elected Jewish president. He's abusing the historical legacy that we have, and he's abusing our ability to use history to try to make some kind of judgment on what's happening now.
We're going to break the.
So this is just few comments that I wanted you to be aware of. I also will then, at the end of presentation, I would like to share my screen with some thoughts. We'll be answering questions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my close friend, Dr. Vitaly Chernetsky, who is an expert, an interpreter, been a director for the Eurasian and East European Studies at the KU Lawrence campus. And he is one of the leaders of Ukrainian community, not only in this area, but worldwide. Vitaly, please.
Thank you so much, Alexei, and thank you everyone for being here and for showing your interest and support of the people of Ukraine at these dark and difficult times. I have prepared a PowerPoint which may have too much information, so I don't want to overburden folks, but I think that for many of us, an explainer is necessary. And hopefully I will be at least a little bit helpful. So I will now share screen with my PowerPoint and go ahead and get started. And I will be keeping my eye on the time so that I don't go over a lot of time, and we have plenty of time for discussion. So, we are going to play from start. So, you may have heard many people say that the word Ukraine means borderland. It's actually a false etymology, and Ukraine is not really a borderland country, but it's a country that is a nexus of many different cultures meeting. And one of the challenges of its natural borders, especially the borders to the north and the east, that they are through plains, through areas where there is not a significant geographical barrier, and that has created a bigger challenge, but Ukrainian troops are heroically defending their land. Ukraine also is not a small country. On the mental map of many people, this was just a small country because it's something that they not have heard before. Here you see the outline of Ukraine overlaid over a portion of northeast and midwestern US. So a country as big as stretching from Chicago to New York and from Toronto to Raleigh, North Carolina, a pretty sizable country. So it's the largest country by area fully in Europe, more than a third larger than Germany. By comparison, Texas is just slightly larger, but Texas is large. We all know that. Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. The Ukrainian steppes, prairie lands have arguably the richest soil in the world for grain production. It was strategically important for trade and agricultural products since as early as ancient Greece. as wheat, sunflower also is hugely important. So very much alike to what we see here in Kansas. So wheat and sunflowers, which is why when I moved here, it was so moving for me to see that. It was a historical hub of a lot of trade routes, a land rich in mineral resources, and also a place with a highly educated population. It's now a very important IT and high-tech hub. It had a seriously industrialized territory going back to the 19th century. The Soviets built a lot of military industry installations, and what it means that there is a very educated population that is one of its richest resources. In terms of Ukraine's history, we have to realize that the territory of Ukraine for much of its history was divided between several empires. And as you just heard in the recorded remarks from Professor Snyder, it does not mean that Ukraine is somehow less of a nation, because most European nations, with a small exception of maybe the border between Portugal and Spain, has been stable for 1,000 years. Most other European borders have been shifting, and the possessions of territory did not necessarily overlay with national identities. So we have several periods of Ukrainian independence. We had a tragedy known as Holodomor, the horrible artificial famine that was unleashed by Stalin in the early 1930s, and which in its traumatic effect can be compared to the great Irish famine of the 19th century. The Chernobyl disaster, which is something you've heard of in 1986, was another major impact. So I will go through history briefly and highlighting a few of those things. You see photographs of the 6 presidents of Ukraine since it regained independence in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So a lot of the discourse that you hear about the early medieval history is that there was a state called the Rus, and Rus is often confused by people with Russia, which should not be done, because basically the lands that came to be known as the country of Russia did not use this name for self-identification until late 17th, 18th century. And the word Rus is of actually Scandinavian origin. So as Professor Snyder said, a Viking prince who was ruling over this territory maybe got baptized in the Byzantine Empire in the late 10th century, and that was an impact on history. You see here in white outlined the territory of modern Ukraine, which overlays with the core of this very important medieval kingdom, which can be seen as the medieval Viking states as predecessors of modern Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And no one says that, just because there were Vikings together, that, contemporary Denmark or Sweden should not be separate countries. So we have this very powerful medieval kingdom that was an equal trading and intermarrying with the royal families of France and Hungary and other countries. But then we had the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, and most of the Ukrainian lands in the 14th century came to be part of what was known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a very large country, which was an interesting country within Europe for several centuries in that it had a considerable amount of liberty. It had elected kings, it had a parliament of the nobility, and it was a very diverse place. It had a very large Jewish community at the time that many countries in Europe expelled their Jewish populations. And it was very religiously diverse, including having both Eastern and Western Christians, and Ukrainians were Eastern Christians or Orthodox Christians, and Poles and Lithuanians were Roman Catholic. And it was in the late 16th century, with the counter-reformation movement of that the Vatican was trying to bring back the Eastern Christians into the fold, and that created tensions that led to a unrest and a war and the first establishment of Ukrainian independence. And what happened that at the time, because Constantinople had already fallen to the Ottoman Empire, the Muscovite state to the northeast, which had just emerged to independence from the Mongol Empire a few decades ago, was the only state still which had Eastern Christian rulers at the time. And even though it was culturally very different from the Ukrainian lands, the Ukrainians signed a treaty for cooperation in 1654. And what happened, we had a misunderstanding of two cultures. Ukrainians were part of this democratic society that was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and thought it was a treaty of equal states and equal parties. And the Muscovite state interpreted it as Ukrainians willingly subjugating themselves to Muscovite rule. And it is that misunderstanding that led to a lot of tragedy and a lot of trouble later. And even despite that war and the fact that the result of that war in the 17th century, Ukraine was divided in half between the territory that ended up being possessed by Moscow and the territory that stayed under the Polish rule, it was a land of great cultural blossoming. It was the cultural center of the Eastern Christian world, and it had major universities and things of the kind that the Muscovite state, which was not yet called Russia at the time, did not have. In fact, what happened, it was the Ukrainian intellectuals under Muscovite rule in late 17th, early 18th century that explained to the Muscovite leadership the continuity between that medieval kingdom and what was happening now. And it was in the early 18th century that they embraced the name Russia, which actually comes from the Greek word for the Rus lands, Rossiya. And the Greeks called the lands around Kiev, Ukrainian lands, Mikra Rossiya, that is the core Rus lands. And the lands around Moscow, Makra Rossiya, sort of the far outskirts, the distant lands. But this was reinterpreted as the big Russia, as in big, strong, and powerful for Russia, and little Russia for Ukraine, as in small, weak, younger brother. And it is that misinterpretation that also had a profound impact for later history. So with the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the end of the 18th century, Ukraine was fully divided between two empires, the Russian Empire and the Austrian Empire, which later became the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this meant that culturally, while it was a one ethnic group that spoke the same language, they developed in two different political cultures, and that allowed also for a freedom and dialogue between the Austrian state had considerably more freedoms, but while in the parts under Russian rule, they were able to go through this industrialization with the help of the British industrialists that came in the 19th century. So with this complicated history, what it led to were also the development of certain stereotypical views. And the especially unfortunate were the Russian stereotypes. So as you can see here, in this 19th century stereotypical views, Ukraine was simultaneously Russia's Italy and Poland's Scotland. And you may think that this sounds silly, how something could be both like Italy and like Scotland, but this is what happens with stereotypes. For the Polish culture, Ukraine and Ukrainian lands were like Scotland in the novels of Sir Walter Scott, a land of great past, of brave warriors, of mysterious castles, of hospitality and legends. And in the Russian cultural imagination, it was more like this stereotypical view of Italians as cheerful people who like good food, who do not necessarily like to work hard, whose land is very fertile, and who like to sing and dance a lot. In a very notorious pronouncement by the Russian poet Alexander Pushkin, he described Ukrainians as a singing and dancing tribe. And this offensive, essentially racist stereotype is what has been the foundation for a lot of Russians in their views of Ukraine. What also was happening in the Slavic lands, both inside and outside the Russian Empire, is the idea of the so-called Slavophilism, of thinking that there are many of these nations that have related languages, just like Scandinavian countries have related languages, and whether they should form some sort of unity. And of course, very different visions of that unity. So the Russians, of course, saw it as all of them subjugating themselves to Russian domination. Well, it was in Ukraine that a federation of free Slavic nations idea was promoted. And Taras Shevchenko, Ukraine's great national poet, was saying that Ukraine is looking for its own Washington. What also happened is that the Russian Empire got increasingly more repressive after 1863, and Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture was severely oppressed. There were bans on publication of all materials in Ukrainian. The very words of Ukrainian were forbidden from use in print, books removed from libraries, and so on and so forth. Fortunately, the small portion of Ukraine that was under Austrian rule did not sustain those bans, and so Ukrainian culture could continue actively because the books could still be published in the parts of Ukraine under Austrian rule. Moving forward to the 20th century, after the great turmoil of the revolution of 1917, with the collapse of the Russian Empire, many of the colonized nations, including Poland and Finland and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Ukraine, and in the Caucasus, Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan, they all proclaimed independence. And Ukraine remained independent until 1921, and it was forcibly incorporated into the Bolshevik rule territory. And it was, as Professor Snyder noted, the Bolsheviks realized how strong Ukrainians' aspirations for independence were. So instead of just calling it Soviet Russia, it became the Soviet Union, a federation of, on paper, independent states who willingly joined the union, and Ukraine is one of the founding members of that union. And in the 1920s, we had great cultural renaissance, but it was came to a halt in the early 30s with Stalin's consolidating power and also unleashing this horrible policy of pacifying, subduing the countryside, so to break the spirit of the Ukrainian nation, and creating this artificial famine with, you see here on the slide, that many parts of Ukraine lost 25% or more of its population in just 2 years. And the most conservative estimates talk about nearly 4 million people dead, and others say that even more died. But also this was something that hugely traumatized people. And basically any Ukrainian family will tell you that they have family members who were directly affected by that trauma. And this was accompanied by Stalinist terror, which proportionately was even more severe in Ukraine than in other parts of the Soviet Union. And thousands of members of Ukrainian intellectual elite, writers, scientists, artists, were arrested, many of them shot immediately, others sent to the Gulag and died there. Again, nearly every Ukrainian person will tell you that they have family members who went through this, and unfortunately, I'm no exception to this. Ukraine also suffered greatly during World War II, and this is another area where people in the West are often ignorant and think of Soviet participation in the war as Russian participation. Ukraine was actually the territory where some of the worst atrocities were committed by the Nazis, and also Ukrainian people suffered greatly in terms of their population losses. And we're talking about Ukrainian people of all ethnic and religious backgrounds. So this includes a part of the tragedy of the Holocaust. More than 1 million Ukrainian Jews were killed by the Nazis during the war, and many other non-combatants of Jewish backgrounds were killed. More than 2.5 people were lost at the front, and nearly 3 million people were deported. The Germans deported Ukrainians to work in Germany as slave laborers, the so-called Ostarbeiter, and about 1 million people were deported in the early days of the war by the Soviets to Siberia, also basically as slave labor. Ukrainians, however, continued resisting, and you see here an underground flyer from Ukrainian underground movement that was fighting both the Nazis and the Soviets, and it continued fighting the Soviets until the mid-1950s. And this shows the Soviet Union as a prison of nations. And Ukraine was one of the major places of a revival of the dissident movement in the 1960s, including a critique of Soviet imperialism from the Marxist leftist positions. Ivan Zubov, one of Ukraine's great dissident thinkers, articulated this already in the 1960s in his famous book, Internationalism or Russification, where he said that from the Marxist standpoint, what the Soviet Union was doing was a perversion of the ideas of internationalism and equality that were included in the original writings of Karl Marx. And as you see here, a note that the local KGB and censorship were more repressive in Ukraine than they were in Moscow because the local henchmen were particularly brutal. And in 1986, the disaster of Chernobyl, a station that have now been captured by Russian invaders in the current war, the worst nuclear accident in the world, has led to the fact that, as one Ukrainian writer put, Ukrainian independence arrived with a bitter taste of the apocalyptic. I see that I'm nearly out of time, so I am going to just scroll through the slides that remain where I talk about the period of regained independence in the last 30 years. Very important thing is that the independence referendum was overwhelmingly supported by the more than majority population in all the regions of Ukraine. And when what happened is the so-called political technologists, various pundits, just like in this country, people are trying to divide Americans between the so-called red states and blue states, and we know that the reality is much more complicated. They were trying to perpetrate a similar division in Ukraine, and this after the 2004 presidential election, which of course that stolen election went to the first of the new Ukrainian revolutions, the Orange Revolution, which showed that Ukrainian people choose democracy and an orientation towards the international value of democracy, equality, and dignity. They continued this struggle, even though they had setbacks in the person of this gentleman who came to power in 2010, was a crony of President Putin and was deposed in the second revolution of the Revolution of Dignity of Winter 13-14. President Poroshenko came to power, and then President Zelensky, the current president. And the important thing is, I'm going to skip through this, is you can see that Ukraine was united in both presidential elections. So the idea that Ukrainians are fractured and divided are false. And one of the most important legacies of the revolution is the spirit of volunteerism. Ukrainians are organized and mobilized, and this was one of the main legacies of the so-called Euromaidan, the Revolution of Dignity of Winter 13-14, that was seen by the Russian leadership as such an existential threat that they invaded Ukraine after that revolution. And the new invasion that began in February 24th mobilized the entire country in this volunteer effort and awe-inspiring courage in the face of incredible adversity. Ukrainian people are fighting incredibly hard. So please help them in their courageous fight against the invaders, because they're fighting not just for themselves, but for the ideas of democracy and progress and dignity and equality for the entire world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vitaly. Thank you very much. I would like, before opening for the questions, I would like to make few final remarks. And if you, Vitaly, I want to share my screen one more time. So the important things that I would like to give you an update on the current military situation. So the incredible job and professionalism and sacrifice of Ukrainian men and women fighting this invasion had stopped and stabilized because Russia did not achieve its objective. It's now going, as you heard from Professor Snyder, to a scenario where they're trying to depopulate the country, wipe it out, and bomb it. I also would like to remind you that Ukraine was a part of allies, US allies in the multinational forces in Afghanistan. So we are kind of brothers in arms with history. And I would like to maybe summarize a brief history of Ukraine within European Asian context by pointing out that somewhere around 11th, 12th, I think maybe a bit later, some 1200s, there were two events on the opposite side of Eurasia. In one, there was an establishment of Magna Carta, which is in England, the sort of first understanding of democracy which was expanding. And at the same, roughly the same decade, Genghis Khan was born in Mongolia. And the idea of rule was that you have only one person at the top. So when Dr. Chernetsky is showing you a bunch of Ukrainian presidents, and we can show a bunch of US presidents at the same time, the only person who held power in Russia was Putin. So basically, Ukraine is a front line of the traditional authoritarianism and democracy. And back in 13th century, Ukraine did not get help from the Western world fighting Mongols. We are getting help now, and we appreciate this help, but we need to be very much aware of the language and very much aware of the propaganda tricks that are important here. So I summarize here on the screen few of those, and I also placed here a link to a charity which helps wounded soldiers. And we'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Kimberly, do we have questions? Can you formulate?
Yes, I was just going to say that if anyone has a question that they would like to pose, they can actually just unmute themselves. We can take the take the PowerPoint.
That might be a little bit messy. Maybe chatting would be easier than 60 people unmuting themselves.
If we had 60 people, you'd be correct. I'm hoping that someone will. Maybe if we could take down the PowerPoint, that would be helpful. Of course, anyone can put a question in the chat, or we typically allow people to unmute themselves and ask their questions themselves.
Okay. Let's unmute.
But
I really would like to keep
Chernetsky,
this page. Yeah.
we really appreciate all the information. I was going to comment. It's just how do I say this? I'm really grateful for the historians. Let me say that it's so much information, and it's with a lot of things that we deal with. As we learn a little bit, we realize how much we don't know, how much more we need to learn. You know, obviously there are classes and books, and we could spend years learning about the history of Ukraine, the rich, beautiful history of Ukraine. And this is really, your presentation has really sparked interest about that, so thank you. So we have a question from Claudia Burford. She says, is there anything we can do in Kansas City to support Ukrainian refugees who are coming here?
Yes, absolutely. There are large numbers of refugees are not in the US yet. So what is happening is that folks who have left who were able to leave Ukraine mostly to neighboring countries within the European Union, like Poland or Romania, are now then making ways to places where they have a family or friends. So a small number of people from Ukraine are beginning to trickle in. Many universities are identifying, ramping up the programs for the so-called scholars at risk. So placing academics from the areas that were directly affected by the Russian invasion, especially the cities that are being bombed very heavily right now, or the territories that were already invaded, taken control by Russia back in 2014. So we are trying to bring at least one such scholar here to KU. Beyond that, there are many excellent charities, and there are several great link trees that have been developed, and I'm going to post the two of them in chat. One of them is by the organization and a New York City-based nonprofit called Razom for Ukraine. Razom means together. And they have several suggestions, which include how to write to your elected representatives and what to ask in support of Ukraine, several vetted legitimate charities to give, and so on and so forth. Another link tree was developed by Kimberly St. Julian Varnon, who is an African-American historian of Ukraine. And what Kimberly has done is developed a lot of resources that are specifically for people of color in Ukraine, whether foreign students or Ukrainians of color, other minorities, including indigenous minorities like Roma, Ukrainians with disabilities who are now affected by the war, and so on and so forth. So these two link trees between them contain many excellent resources. I'm now going to post them in chat, and I encourage folks to look at them and see if there is a charity of your choice or any other action that you would like to take. There are also protests happening in support of Ukraine every weekend in Lawrence and in Kansas City, Missouri at the Plaza. So please contact the Ukrainian Club of Kansas City. You can find them easily on Facebook and other social media, and ask them about the protest, and joining. Just physical show of support is also greatly appreciated.
I would like to jump in on this and just give perhaps a somewhat broader perspective. I totally agree with what Vitaly said, but I think we should not forget that this is not about US helping Ukraine. This is about US helping Ukraine to help US. So please keep your democratic institutions. Don't let people who are in fond of authoritarian regimes take over this country, because the reason there was no attack on Ukraine 3 years ago was because Ukraine was basically given to us on a silver platter to Putin. And I think it's important to recognize that this is our common fight.
That's really good. Kind of to that point, Dr. Ladoshin, there was a question about, and Dr. Ternetsky, a question about where could individuals get the most reliable information and kind of avoid any, of the bias or propaganda? What would you recommend?
There are good resources that Shevchenko societies, Putin Vitaly would know that, and there are several informational websites such as Taras Berezovets on the current situation in Ukraine. It's English speaking, and there are lectures. So some people were asking where to hear more about history. Timothy Snyder has wonderful lectures. If you go and look Timothy Snyder on Ukraine, you will get an hour worth of brilliant lecture, but Vitaly can give more information on this.
In terms of the accurate news, I actually need to say that many of the leading US and other international media who were ignoring Ukraine or who out of casual laziness were reporting on Ukraine from Moscow and inadvertently regurgitated Moscow optics on events in Ukraine are not doing that anymore. If you listen to National Public Radio this morning in Morning Edition, you heard that Leila Fadel is now in Lviv in Ukraine, so they are broadcasting on the ground. So the National Public Radio is doing excellent work. So I very strongly recommend their coverage. Many other serious news media like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the magazines like The Atlantic and the New Republic have been doing that. Not all are being equally careful, and but certainly NPR, I think, is at a very high standard. In terms of Ukrainian English language publications, the newspaper, the Kyiv Independent, is really excellent, and they have wonderful, brave journalists there on the ground who also providing the perspective. You can find sometimes there, if the website goes down, a Twitter feed, but here one needs to be very careful. There is a lot of noise, and there are a lot of people on social media like Twitter who are throwing in the fog of war or the so-called whataboutism perspectives, who are trying to muddle the situation, who are diverting the discussion into other issues that are really just meant to be as a diversionary tactic so that people would forget about the atrocities that the Russian state is now committing in Ukraine.
I would point out that some of this diversion can clearly be seen in this chat, so I'm going to ignore some of those questions. But I am going to go this one. Do you know where I can can help by fighting on the front line? This is you contact Ukrainian embassy, and there is a new force that's being formed, very much like a foreign legion, that is not associated in NATO in any way or form, but has military professionals from all over the world, and they will basically start their engagement in few days on the side of Ukraine. This is very much like during the war of against fascism in Spain when it was starting. So there were a lot of people volunteering. And as a matter of fact, very similar, although it didn't take much of time, but there was a volunteer US pilots effort. They were US, but they were not representing government, fighting Japanese when they were invading China. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor happened, and then the entire United States went into war.
Dr. Ladoshin or Dr. Chernetsky, either one. This last slide that is up, could you go through statement by statement and give a little more information? Like it's about propaganda, but not all of us are quite sure what is the proper, what is the truth, what's not the truth. So please.
So let me, I put this together, and I really put it about 5 minutes before this one, because yesterday my daughter came from Ukraine. So my daughter was living with her mother's parents, her grandparents, in the city of Ivano-Frankivsk. And that was a concerted effort. And I was rather overwhelmed to see her again and be able to hug her. And she had given me some help. So these are very outlines. So I just wanted to point out that whatever Lindsey Graham did was really just supporting Putin, because his statement plays on a loop in Russian propaganda. So just be aware, what is it that you are saying, and whether you're trying to collect votes for the next election or you're really trying to understand what's happening in the world. That's number one. The second one, the statement of crisis or events in Ukraine without spelling out the culprit is damaging to Ukraine. I get a lot of emails. They say, well, isn't this terrible? What's happening in Ukraine? Isn't this one? What do you mean, what is happening in Ukraine? You have like hurricane, you have earthquake. What is happening? It's happening to Ukraine. You have to spell out the culprit. This is how you will identify and not model the situation. This is Russian Federation attacking independent country. This is not Putin attacking. This is 200,000 people attacking with really very limited protest that is happening. I was amazed to see on BBC News when IKEA decided to leave Moscow because of the aggression, and they showed this educated middle-class Russians in Moscow lining up on the streets. Were they lining up to protest the war their country was waging? No, they were trying to catch the last sale on the last day in IKEA. So whenever you bring the question about, oh, how terrible that the Russian restaurants will be trashed out by a mob of unruly Ukrainians in the United States or something like that, that I see on Twitter, this is all nonsense. This is diversion. This is propaganda. Again, the same is, oh, we have such a weak president in the United States here. Yes, mistakes were made in the Obama administration and treachery was made afterwards, but US actually and UK had been really helping and got on board Germany and France and everyone else. And right now, it's a coalition of countries. And the point that you can hear a lot, and here it gets misinterpreted, why don't you establish a no-fly zone? And this is really people who don't understand technicality, no military. I actually was trained in the military, and I understand. I have a rank of lieutenant of armed forces from my undergraduate education, which was compulsory. And I understand clearly the inability to do it in this context. This no-fly zone basically disparages Ukrainians because they think it's, well, you're not doing it for some reason. Most of the damage and most of the atrocities are done by ballistic missiles and by long-range artillery. You cannot close the sky from those. So the West is doing a lot of logistical support, a lot of arms going there. Now, as I said, there is a volunteer force that will be coming and squeezing out very aggressively and with political risks. What this administration is doing is politically risky because what? The gas prices are gonna go up. And we all know how Americans hate when their gas prices go up. So please be patient. We need those. It will be a spike in gas prices. We need to snuff out the ability of Russian military to reform and replenish itself. Well, that's about it, and I can stop sharing now from this point.
Thank you for that. I think that was really helpful, very informative. It's sometimes hard for those of us like myself, a little, less educated, to know when I hear something on the news, like how to weigh it, right? Yesterday, I was hearing a conversation specifically about the no-fly zone, and they were explaining that if you say that, then you have to enforce it by shooting down planes or anything that goes through the no-fly zone. And in the discussion on the news, they weren't sure that would benefit Ukraine to do that.
Exactly. That will bring even harder things because there's a very fantastic, I highly recommend, let me see if I can share this just for you to see this fellow. Go to his website. It's called Bio of the Fifth Column.
Okay.
And he is absolutely fantastic. He does military. He's a veteran. He looks like this bearded guy in the middle of southern state in his garage, gives best military analysis possible, very honest.
Awesome.
He has separate like few-minute videos on all these subjects. I highly recommend this as a good source. Or email to me and I'll send you the links. You can find me on the KUMC website. I will be happy to share more information with you.
I really appreciate that. I think that people more than anything want to know where they can go for more information, because obviously this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? 55 minutes doesn't begin to even touch the surface. So people are looking for reliable sources, places to go. So I think maybe one of the best, tools you've given us today, Dr. Chernetsky and Dr. Lodahin, is the links and the places we can go ourselves to find more information. Irina, do we have any other questions, comments before? I know we're getting close to the noon hour.
Yeah, I think most of the questions were covered. And I think there's just some comments about the last post that Dr. Lodahin shared.
So since you will be posting this recording, people will be able to find. I understand I did it very briefly, but people will be able to see it.
Correct. First, Alexa will send an email to everyone who was on today, and we'll include the link, and then we'll post that on our website. So you can also share it out however you want, and people will be able to find it on our website. Absolutely. Dr. Chernetsky, any final thoughts? Or?
I see there is the question from Mr. Faseru, and I'm just going to answer that quickly. Why is President Zelensky asking for a no-fly zone? This is part of the state-to-state negotiations. So from what folks who are more specialists in contemporary international relations explain to me, I'm a literature and culture person, is the making sure that there is a strength keeping the allies strong and united. So these things are, these are sort of tactical things in international negotiations and rallying support. So I think this is where we see the complexities of those things. And here, of course, in Kansas, in the Kansas City metro area, we have a lot of military specialists with Fort Leavenworth and other places. So there, I know that folks at Fort Leavenworth, folks at K-State who also work in military history and strategy, they have been also doing very serious analyzing, and they're in contact with government think tanks. So people are not taking this lightly. There are a lot of good things happening. I also wanted to mention another excellent US veteran who actually is a reporter reporting on the ground in Ukraine, and this is Nolan Peterson. He has done really wonderful reporting, and so that also would be an excellent perspective. You can find him on social media or through the publications that he has been producing online. Another great insight would be Terrell Starr, who is an African-American scholar now working also on the ground in Ukraine and also helping with evacuation of folks of color who are stranded. So there are a lot of good people. And if folks are curious to find through the link trees and through the comments we've given, you can find much more information. Also, you will see that a lot of media are now bringing attention to Ukrainian culture. So you will see in New York Times, in the Atlantic magazine, in a lot of other places saying, here are books of Ukrainian literature and translation. Here are some great Ukrainian composers. Here are wonderful Ukrainian movies. So this is not just a place to which bad things happen. We have to realize that this is a place with great, rich culture. Many Americans would not know probably that Carol of the Bells, one of the staples of what you hear over and over again, during the winter holiday season is actually a Ukrainian folk tune to which they wrote English language lyrics in the 1930s. So
interesting.
you will find Ukrainian culture that is touched you in some of the very unexpected places. So thank you for being here. Thank you for showing your support and curiosity, and please try to find out more.
And I would like to end just by recognizing, I mean, there is your, like you and Alexei, your trauma going on in your life. You know, Dr. Ladoshin, you just mentioned that your daughter was just reunited with you yesterday, and yet you've been so generous with your time and your efforts and your willingness. And I know, Dr. Chernetsky, you are being on demand for everyone. And at a time when you're under so much stress and so much worry, it's just amazing to me, the spirit of both of you, your generosity of spirit to share, to be there for us, you know, and we really need to be there for you. So thank you so much. I think you're extraordinary human beings, and we really appreciate you tremendously.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you for organizing this and for all the care and support for people of Ukraine in these difficult days. Please continue supporting. This is a good fight. This is for the whole humanity, because Ukraine now is on the front line of struggling for democracy and equality and all the things we hold dear and right in the whole world. So Ukraine should not be allowed to be defeated.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!